So for this video, I wanted to use the 2006 rhetorical analysis essay to basically provide a step-by-step breakdown, very much like I've done in the other essay types, right? So in this case, I'm going to read the passage verbatim. I'm going to analyze it as I would in my head. So if anything, this video just serves what's going on in my head as I'm reading a prompt and this passage, and just kind of like how I'm formulating a thesis, topic sentences, evidence, and so forth. So without further ado, we're going to consider this one right here. So we're going to first attack the prompt in considering all the elements here. I'm going to read a lot of stuff here verbatim, so if you want to skip ahead, just feel free to do so, but otherwise I'm just going to kind of read everything in this one just as I would sort of stream of consciousness oriented. So this one states, in the following passage from George Bernard Shaw's play St. Joan, which is based on the life of Joan of Arc, which is the years provided here. Joan, a young French woman, is on trial in a church court for allegedly spreading heresy, beliefs at variance with established religious doctrine. Now, that's nice to give you a definition in case you don't know what it is. Dressed in armor, Joan led the French troops against the English. She was eventually captured, turned over to the English, and then tried by French clerics who supported the English. The most serious crime she was charged with was her claim that she had received direct inspiration from God. Carefully read the Inquisitor's speech to the church court whose members were to decide Joan's fate. Then, in a well-written essay, analyze the rhetorical strategies the Inquisitor uses to argue his case against Joan. So we have to consider the point of view of this Inquisitor, we have to consider the person who is being tried, and we have to consider who the audience is, right? It's mentioning French clerics who supported the English, but it's kind of ironic because Joan basically led the French troops, so it's her own country people who are trying her in this case, despite her, putting herself out there for them. So a few things to consider first and foremost in my bullet points. Number one, it comes from a play, so it's dialogue based, it's a long speech, it's dramatized, right? So I'm considering that everything here is, I guess, for romantic purposes, it's not perhaps like an actual court account. It's something to dramatize a particular situation. So there is an element of fiction to it, but just consider that it's one big dialogue. Number two, it revolves around Joan of Arc on religious grounds. Dialogue probably going to focus on the grounds of God, scripture, and the church as ethos, right? Because we're looking at French clerics, we're looking at an inquisitor, they're trying her because she was a heretic. So everything here has to come from like the evidence of religion, largely at least. And then lastly, like I mentioned earlier, it's ironic that her own people are trying her, the French people themselves. So without further ado, I'm going to chunk this reading as I see fit in terms of where it is broken down by topics or change of tone or so forth. One thing to consider if you're looking at the wholeness of this piece is that it's one big-ass paragraph, so it's going to be hard to break down if you're not used to chunking, but this is kind of how I've broken it down, and obviously where you stop and where you begin is entirely up to you. So I'll read everything verbatim, and I'll try to do it as quickly as possible. So the Inquisitor, dropping his blandness and speaking very gravely, luckily we get some tone already from this piece here. If you had seen what I have seen of heresy, you would not think it a light thing, even its most apparently harmless and even lovable and pious origins. Heresy begins with people who are to all appearance better than their neighbors, a gentle and pious girl, or a young man who has obeyed the command of our Lord by giving all his riches to the poor, and putting on the garb of poverty, the life of austerity, and the rule of humility and charity, may be the founder of a heresy that will wreck both the church and empire, if not ruthlessly stamped out in time. Okay, so we'll stop there real quick. It seems like this guy has a familiarity with heresy, and at the same time it seems like he makes a point and claim that heresy is deceptive, that even the most innocent or basically nicest looking person is perhaps a heretic, right? So in this case, it's kind of saying like, hey, look at Joan, don't be deceived by her, because it seems like she is just using that as an excuse or to, make us lessen our condemnation towards her. So furthermore, he says, the records of the Holy Inquisition are full of histories we dare not give to the world, because they are beyond the belief of honest men and innocent women. Yet they all began with saintly simpletons. I have seen this again and again. And lastly, it seems like this guy is talking from, again, the precedents that the church has seen. He mentions the fact that it's full of histories of information that they dare not give to the world. So it shows that it's just frightening how much heresy is. So it's kind of like instilling fear. So it's a scare tactic in this case. Already we know that there's a lot of logical fallacies in this because it is religious based, but we're not here to criticize him. We're here to see how he's being effective with his choices. The guy further writes, "Mark what I say, the woman who quarrels with her clothes and puts on the dress of a man is like the man who throws off his fur gown and dresses like John the Baptist. They are all followed as surely as the night follows the day by bands of wild women and men who refuse to wear any clothes at all. When maids will neither marry nor take regular vows, and men reject marriage and exalt their lusts into divine inspirations, then, as surely as the summer follows the spring, they begin with polygamy and end by incest. Heresy at first seems innocent and even laudable, but it ends in such a monstrous horror of a natural wickedness that the most tender-hearted among you, if you saw it at work as I have seen it, would clamor against the mercy of the Church in dealing with it." And so it's kind of a long two-part argument that he puts in this chunk here, where one, he makes this like extended analogy of clothing alluding to like sainthood, but also the illusion of sainthood, because it says like dresses like John the Baptist, but you aren't John the Baptist. So basically, Joan is dressing up falsely. She is leading through deception, and it's a facade, right? It's an illusion, and he just talks about how the people who follow her are not even regular citizens, but like the wild ones, right? The ones who lack reason and so forth. The guy even talks about like the conventions of marriage and women and men, where he's kind of saying, hey, look what happens when you don't have a woman in the household and a man doing the work and so forth. Basically, tradition leads to, the right path, but a breaking of tradition leads to things like polygamy and incest. And it's kind of like, whoa, slippery slope. But again, we're not here to criticize him. He's just a little bit ill-informed. But otherwise, the guy talks a lot about the danger of heresy and the fact that it's like monstrous, right? A natural wickedness. And the entire time, it's just a big warning against the actions that Joan has done thus far. He further writes, or says, "For 200 years the Holy Office has striven with these diabolical madnesses, and it knows that they begin always by vain and ignorant persons setting up their own judgment against the Church, and taking it upon themselves to be the interpreters of God's will. You must not fall into the common error of mistaking these simpletons for liars and hypocrites. They believe honestly and sincerely that their diabolical inspiration is divine. Therefore, you must be on your guard against your natural compassion. You are all, I hope, merciful men. How else could you have devoted your lives to the service of our gentle Savior? You are going to see before you a young girl, pious and chaste. For I must tell you, gentlemen, that the things said by her by our English friends are supported by no evidence, whilst there is abundant testimony that her excesses have been excesses of religion and charity, and not of worldliness and wantonness." And so it goes back again, very beginning of this whole chunk here, right? That it's the ethos of the Church again. 200 years they've been fighting heretics, and the heretics are they're always these vain and ignorant people. He criticizes her because, she thinks she's doing right, but ultimately he's talking about the fact that, she is more than just a liar and hypocrite. She's just someone who intentionally goes out and commits evil. He then kind of starts extending his message towards the men, the clerics who are judging her, and he says like, hey, look, I know you're a nice guy, and I know you wanted to save someone like her, right? Looks innocent and pious, but you gotta be careful. Like I said earlier, looks are deceiving. So in this case, he's trying to discredit her. Toward the end, he says like, look, even though she said she did all these things, and her English friends said all these things, she's not right. I'm right. So the entire time it's like this big ad hominem, just attacking her character and attacking her person type thing, just making the cleric just feel, yeah, I'm right and she's bad. And lastly, Inquisitor speaks. "This girl is not one of those whose hard features the sign of hard hearts, and whose brazen looks and lewd demeanor condemn them before they are accused. The devilish pride that has led her into present peril has left no mark on her countenance. Strange as it may seem to you, it has even left no mark on her character outside those special matters in which she is proud, so that you will see a diabolical pride and a natural humility seated side by side in the selfsame soul. Therefore be on your guard. God forbid that I should tell you to harden your hearts for her punishment if we condemn her. will be so cruel that we should forfeit our own hope of divine mercy, were there one grain of malice against her in our hearts. But if you hate cruelty, and if any man here does not hate it, I command him on his soul's salvation to quit this holy court. I say, if you hate cruelty, remember that nothing is so cruel in its consequences as the toleration of heresy. So, the final sort of argument that this Inquisitor gives is the fact that she has this demeanor of pride and righteousness. Like, look at her. She looks like she's innocent. And the thing is, a lot of people we try in this court look like they've done crimes, hardened people with brazen looks and so forth, but she's different. And so it's admittedly more difficult to judge her and to punish her. But towards the end, he addresses his audience once more, where he says, look, if you don't like cruelty, then get the fuck out of my court, because you would rather tolerate heresy than tolerate cruelty, and that is not what something a clergyman should be able to do. So this is really a two-part speech, where one is a defamation of Joan of Arc, just talking shit about her the entire time, and the second half is almost kind of like underhandedly talking shit about the clerics, where he's really just saying, look, if you don't have the balls to do this, then don't do it. Get someone else who's more willing to do it and all that there. So it pressures the cleric, it makes Joan look bad, and that's really the two components that you see in this entire play's excerpt. So first we got to establish a thesis, right? We got to consider what are some things that he generally did in these last 4 chunks that I did. And I hope it helps you for more difficult readings. Usually for more difficult readings, I mean, I wouldn't say this is a particularly difficult reading compared to like 1800s essays, right? Plays are a little bit more digestible, but the thing is, it's still like more antiquated in terms of its topic and so forth. So chunking really helps you understand and process piece by piece what one section was all about. And it's kind of like why I assigned that one homework where you're annotating chunks by yourself, because it's whatever helps you, right? Whatever fragments of information that you can process at once before linking into another. But that aside, we're going to consider now the rhetorical strategies the Inquisitor uses to argue his case against Joan. Again, this guy used a lot of logical fallacies because, again, it comes from religion as his ethos. But we still consider then what were some things that he wanted to do to, in the kairos of his time period and all that would work with his audience. So number one, he repeatedly associates the title of heretic to her, right? He keeps telling the court that she is the one who is wrong, that she is evil, hidden within, and that she is not to be trusted. Number two, he speaks to the audience on the deception of heretics, such as herself. So he's trying to convince to this audience here, like, hey, I get it. It's really hard to assess in this situation, but you have to follow your convictions. And trust me that she is one who is trying to deceive us. Number three, discusses the reliability of the church's methods in past tasks. Because ultimately, he's also kind of like adding the credibility to the church and all the things they've done. So in this case, as he goes along talking about the 200 years of servitude to, the persecution of heretics and all that, it kind of shows that we know what we're doing and we know better than you. And then lastly, he's also urging the audience to scrutinize more cruelly, as you see towards that last chunk, right, where he basically tells them, hey, make sure you're cruel and not lenient towards heresy. And those are kind of like the 4 main things I picked out for this to establish a thesis. So ultimately, my sample thesis might be something like this, where I write, despite Joan of Arc's claims that her actions were from God, that's what she thought, right? And also that's kind of like the situation that's given. Whenever I begin a thesis, I usually start with a situation in the very beginning, just kind of like contextualize from where am I arguing. The Inquisitor of her trial insists that Joan's actions stem from heresy, right? We talked about that. And requires the court to have the utmost vigilance and scrutiny to judge her as such. So in this case, there's 2 things I'm trying to prove in terms of the way that the Inquisitor is trying to back up his case. Number one, he's insisting that she stems from heresy and that nothing here is good or even of good intention. And then lastly, he also requires the court to have like vigilance, scrutiny, that they can't just be lenient in this case here. It's 2 parts, and it covers kind of everything I've talked about in those 4 points earlier. Now, here's the thing that I have to consider too. I need topic sentences and evidence to go along, and luckily for most of the rhetorical analysis readings they give you, they're all pretty short. I think they don't really extend past 800 words, if anything. So in this case, I already have topic sentences that I established earlier on, which really helps me kind of find the evidences, because I'm thinking about, okay, he's associating heretic to her, he's talking to the audience on deception, he's talking about the reliability of the church, he's talking about people here need to scrutinize more. So all I need to do now is find those instances, right? So for the first one, I just need to find instances where the Inquisitor declares her actions heresy towards religion. Super easy, tons of that in terms of anytime he really uses the word heresy, right? Number two, when it talks about speaking to the audience on the deception of heretics, I'm looking for really any part where he talks about how deception is being used, how you can't trust the face of an innocent or a young person or someone who is appearing justified and holding their morals in their face. So it begins with that there. It ends with that as well. It talks about how she is, what do you call it? Oh, let me go back real quick. Train of thought just disappeared. How usually people who come in court are brazen looking, how they are lewd demeanored, but for her, she is actually, pretty decent looking. She is, the image of a pure woman. Discuss the reliability of the church's method in past tasks. We mentioned the whole 200 years experience it's gone through, the horrible cases the church has under its sleeve. So basically, it's like the church knows that much more than you do, and they're just so much more beyond the realm of your understanding. And then lastly, we know that he scrutinizes his own people, right, his clerics, because he talks about the fact that you have to be cruel to Joan, that you have to hold that ability to judge objectively and under the court's sort of laws and religious backgrounds there. And these are all things I can find as long as I know what I'm looking for, and also as long as I've chunked the piece, because I can refer back to any of those 4 chunks that I've done and really find evidence to back up what I need. So that's all rhetorical analysis is. This is my thought process in terms of how I approach it. On any given essay, really, this will take 10-15 minutes for me to do. The reading part is quicker than you think because I'm reading out loud, but in your head, dramatize it, figure out what's happening step by step, and pick out as you are reading it the trends, the motifs, the styles, the methods, the voice, and so forth of any given author. Now, I give one last example here of sophistication, and a lot of people have this question of how do I earn it? Because I think everyone can earn Thesis for sure. Evidence is a little bit hit or miss for some people, but otherwise it's not within or outside the realm of reason of scoring high on that, right? But sophistication always kind of like tricks people up, because if they don't get it, they're thinking like, well, am I not sophisticated? And the answer is it's not really that. It's more so of perhaps you just simply didn't elaborate, or you simply had an instance of it, but it wasn't consistently through, or it didn't occupy a good chunk of your essay. So I offer one example of sophistication. It's always about looking past the surface level of any given work. For a play like this, there's no explicit argument necessarily in terms of what the author's intention was. Speaker we know, the Inquisitors we know, but in this case there might be like a bigger point that Bernard Shaw is offering in his play here. So in this case, I kind of observed this. I said, ironically, the focus shifts from the attention of Joan of Arc towards the other men for this trial. In an attempt to gain support for more cruelty, the Inquisitor instills fear and guilt into his audience if they choose to go against his point of view, the church's or God's. The irony exists in the fact that Joan of Arc is tried for claiming she receives direct inspiration from God, but the Inquisitor and the church does the very same to justify their actions, and it's almost like exposing the bullshit of ethos when it comes to religion, because Joan of Arc basically says, hey, I feel like God is speaking to me and inspires me to do this particular action with good intentions and so forth. It's just that she simply didn't have the trappings of religion behind her, or of as an inquisitor, right? She didn't have that ethos of being a member of the court or of the church, which is kind of ridiculous, because the Inquisitor, besides the fact that he claims that he has this title given to him through this elaborate system, he himself also says that he draws like inspiration from God and all that, right? So at the end of the day is kind of the question of who's right. It exposes the hypocrisy and the same method but different. It's almost sexist. You know what I mean? It's almost sexist, and it shows how religion's always just janky in terms of who is justified, and it just shows how really she didn't fit the normal gender roles, and so she must be evil because she broke the sort of traditions and the expectations and all that. And that, I think that's what George Bernard Shaw was trying to show in his particular play here, in terms of just the willingness of people to rule through fear, either through others or even to themselves in that case.